Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. My name is Drew Benson. I am the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management and a senior wealth advisor with Raymond James. I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. Hey, if you're out there and you're an advisor at one of the large captive investment firms, if you don't own your book of business, but you've always dreamed about the idea of being able to have independence and autonomy where you can fully own your book of business and make the decisions on your clientele that you know is best for them, if that is of interest to you, please reach out to us at True North Wealth Management Group. What we find is that too many people want to make the jump, but they're too afraid to do so. And that's where my business partner, Jason Nero, and I have created a detailed blueprint to move you from point A to point B. And look, we've walked through this ourselves. We know what it's like to move clients to the new firm, and we've had extraordinary success both with our own practices, but also with the other advisors that have joined our group. We have a really great batting average. And if that is of interest to you and you finally want to make the jump so that you can truly own your book of business and actually make the decisions that you believe is best for your clientele, please reach out to us again at True North Wealth Management Group. So today I had another fantastic interview with Lydia Mashburn Newman. Now, Lydia is the managing director of monetary economics at the American Institute for Economic Research. I thought it would be great to have Lydia on today because there's a lot of speculation swirling around what the Fed may or may not do through the second half of the year and getting into 2026. Now, one sort of caveat I want to make before you start listening to this interview is that I had a list of questions for her. And the very first question we actually spent about a half an hour on. And I think it's important because in the back half of the interview, we really talk about present day policy and where we believe the stock market might be going, where we believe the macroeconomy might be going, what could happen from a fiscal standpoint, from a monetary standpoint, if and when the Fed might cut rates. Will they cut rates, et cetera? That's in the back half of the interview. In the first half of the interview, we really spent a lot of time on the historical backdrop. I think if you really want to understand economics or finance or the stock market, people get way too myopic in my estimation, especially when I talk to even a lot of market strategists on Wall Street. People get way too myopic about the present day. And you have to know that the Fed is not just making decisions on monetary policy based on just present circumstances. They're making decisions as a byproduct of potentially decades of things that have occurred in the past. So I would really encourage you to be patient in the first half of this interview because I think so much important context comes out from Lydia about why we had relatively low inflation or extraordinarily low inflation after the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, and why it's very different today. And there were some misconceptions and some things that I learned today that was super helpful. I really felt like I was able to sharpen my axe of having a broader historical backdrop. Once you have that knowledge, I think the second half of the interview is going to be really helpful and instructive for you. So very thankful to Lydia for coming on the podcast. I hope you enjoy today. Lydia, great to see you today. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So let's dig right into the topic today, which is really going to revolve around monetary policy and the Federal Reserve and what that means, generally speaking, for the macroeconomy, but also what does that mean for something like the stock market moving forward? Because I know a lot of clients are asking me questions around what is the Fed going to do? Are they going to cut rates? Are they not going to cut rates? How does tariffs play into all of this? And so my goal with you is to really unpack a lot of these questions. But I think to be fair to the subject, we owe it to ourselves to kind of understand where we came from. And when I think about today's present dynamic, and I'm very curious, Lydia, on your perspective on this, and please feel free to push back. I take pushback well. My take on it is that the Fed is in its current situation on whether they should keep rates steady or cut rates, not only because of present dynamics around, say, policy coming from the White House, but that there's been a historical sort of backdrop that probably goes back, in my estimation, to COVID-19 and lockdowns and then the monetary injections that led, what I think, to inflation. So let's start there. Do you agree with that statement that a lot of what we're dealing with today still has a lot of ramifications from what would have gone back to 2020? And if not, like, what do you think of the drivers of inflation?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And of course, as you what you've essentially said is what macroeconomists love to say, which is monetary policy works with long and variable lags. And what we are working with today are still some of the residual effects related to monetary policy as it was implemented during COVID, and especially mostly post-pandemic when the economy started reopening after the lockdowns. And what many economists and analysts have sort of criticized the Fed for is missing the window for when they should have been changing policy well before we hit that record high inflation in the summer of 22 at 9.1% as measured by the Consumer Price Index. So I think you've definitely laid up, like, let's go back to some of the origins of the inflation we're working through today. How far back would you like me to go about where that is now playing into today?
I mean, I'm open. Like, if you think there's an important narrative that even extends before COVID, like, I would love to hash that out with you.
So I think that there partly is, and not to go too far afield here, but one of the big changes in 2020, not related to COVID, was that the Federal Reserve adopted their new monetary policy strategy and framework, which is basically a statement of how they plan to accomplish their dual mandate that the Fed gave them, which is maximum employment and price stability. This framework that they implemented, it technically got implemented in August of 2020, but they were planning on having it implemented in January, then February, and then March of 2020. And then, of course, the whole world broke out in pandemic by March of 2020,
Wow.
right? That framework, though, was completely geared around a world that was responding to very, very low inflation that we had seen persistently throughout the 2010s post-financial crisis. So basically, as we went into this pandemic, where the Fed is again engaging in extraordinary monetary policy, and we could talk a little bit about what that extraordinary policy looked like, both monetary as well as fiscal policy that fed into inflation later. But the Fed at that time, though, when they were implementing this new framework and when they were studying what their new framework should be, and they do these reviews, they try to do them about once every 5 years is their new schedule. But they were doing this in 2019, looking behind them, saying, well, what has been the big problems in monetary policy? And the big problem in the 2010s was inflation was persistently under the Fed's 2% target. And so they adopted this new framework that said, hey, if we undershoot inflation, we are going to engage in what economists call make-up policy. We will overshoot inflation in other periods in order to make up for the fact that we undershot it for other periods. And this had a lot to do with the fact that you had really low interest rates. You're running into the zero lower bound concern. And basically, monetary policy, the thought was they've lost their monetary policy powder. And can't take action. And so that was the framework they were attempting to implement before the pandemic took hold. And then due to a number of reasons, it got delayed, and they eventually announced it in 2020, August of 2020 in Jackson Hole. But the framework that they announced basically said, okay, if we undershoot inflation, we will overshoot inflation. Well, the whole world, of course, had changed at that point, right? The Fed had already engaged in extraordinary monetary policy, again, like they had during the financial crisis, which meant massive increases in the money supply. We're talking about the first injections of money between basically March to May. The Fed grew their balance sheet by like $2 trillion, from $4 trillion to $6 trillion. And they would eventually... Extraordinary. So, and $4 trillion was already high relative to historical standards. It was left at $4 trillion based on the financial crisis. Prior to the financial crisis, they usually only kept around less than $1 trillion of assets on their books, and they could still conduct monetary policy with that amount. But we were at $4 trillion, which a lot of people thought was high, and then we jumped up to a little more than $6 trillion, basically by May of 2020. And then by, I think it was May of 2020, it peaked in May of 2023. So even after they started hiking rates, the money supply still grew. The money supply, not the balance sheet. But the Fed's balance sheet did end up peaking at just under $9 trillion. And this is very different than a world where we're at the and they had dropped rates, of course, down to essentially zero. And so they were working in this extraordinary environment. We've had lockdowns, we've shut down economic activity, and there's a lot of literature to say that initial response by the Fed of expanding their balance sheet to sort of make up for that collapse, what economists call the collapse of aggregate demand, the collapse of overall economic activity on the demand side of the economy, not the production side of the economy. But we also had a collapse in the production side of the economy. And so the Fed's solution to this was ramp up the money supply. And that is what depending on which monetary economic theory you subscribe to, that was the appropriate behavior to engage in. And that may have been the appropriate response, especially through about the mid 2021 when we started seeing the inflation kick up. But of course, the Fed was like, well, we think this is transitory. We're still in this makeup policy world that our framework has us thinking in that, oh, well, we had a decade of undershooting inflation. Maybe we can run it a little hot. We could keep inflation a little hot for a little longer. And on top of it, the new framework, in addition to making up for those undershoots, the Fed also added or expounded upon what they meant by maximum employment. The Congress tells the Fed focus on maximum employment, which from an economic standpoint,
which is what, 4%?
We roughly think that what the economy can sustain is around 4%. There have been periods when it's been a little lower. There have been periods when it's a little higher. But in modern times, economists think it's somewhere around 4%. But of course, we got below 4%. And some of that people thought it was still dislocations just from the COVID malaise and trying to figure out getting supply chains back online. And so it's true, the economic data was a little hazy. But part of their remit in establishing this new framework is they did say that we want to engage in quote unquote inclusive employment. So some critics of this would characterize it as saying,
sorry to cut you off, like DEI, like DEI type of inclusive employment?
Some critics put it in that realm. The idea being that, the general unemployment rate is around 4%, but we do have different demographic unemployment rates, especially among certain minorities. There are higher unemployment rates. And so some view the Fed's change in this language to inclusive employment to mean we want to affect certain sectors of unemployment and certain demographics of unemployment. As any good macroeconomist will tell you, monetary policy is not a good tool for labor policies. And it takes labor policies to deal with those issues. And they are real issues. You do have very different unemployment rates among certain demographics, especially among African-American communities, which I think is something that policy could potentially address. But you had a study by Christina Romer and her husband David Romer, there's another economics power couple, where they examined the Fed's framework in this inflation episode, and they looked specifically at that inclusive employment side of it. And basically what they found is the data points to the fact that the Fed, quote, ran the economy hot in order to reach these higher employment goals, meaning sustaining unemployment at a rate lower than the economy can actually hold up. And so from her research, her and her husband's research, and she was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under Obama, very respected Berkeley economist. She and her husband find that part of this new framework is what led to the Fed overshooting and overheating the economy. And interestingly, you've had labor economists and other folks who labor scholars have been critical of this approach. So you have macroeconomists who will tell you, monetary policy is a bad, blunt instrument that can't really, in a sustainable way, fix this challenge. But labor economists will say this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what it takes to create longer-term sustainable low unemployment. And so things related to labor policies, incentives, socioeconomic status, and how you adjust things in that realm. Very, very different policies than monetary policy, right? And so this is all an outgrowth of the Fed changing this framework that they implemented in August of 2020. And so when we look at the results of that framework, inflation getting at a 40-year high at 9.1% in the summer of 22, and the Fed consistently trying to say, oh, this is transitory, to me, that says that there's a lot of culpability on the Fed for how things got or kind of went sideways in that regard.
Do you think Powell really believed that it was transitory at the moment? Because I remember hearing him say that it was transitory, and I thought, this is absolutely ludicrous. There's no way this is transitory. But I mean, I know that you can't get into the mind of him, but what do you think was really going through the mind of the folks at the Fed?
I wouldn't want to speak for him per se, but I can say that from what was the information telling us at that time, anyone who is looking at monetary aggregates, which Austrian economists are known to do and monetarists are known to do more than your sort of neo-Keynesian traditional macroeconomist, would tell you, hey, we've flooded the system with a ton of money, not just with monetary stimulus, but also with fiscal stimulus.
Yep.
What are the drivers here? We should be very wary and on the lookout. I do think that some of these other goals that had been sort of introduced into monetary policy may have clouded the judgment, perhaps, or at least clouded the economic data in a way that prevented them from looking at it as clearly as they should have. So I don't want to say whether or not they genuinely thought it was transitory or not transitory, but I do think what you can say is they were not careful about looking at the economic data and the drivers of inflation. And that's part of their macroeconomic understanding and the models and tools that they use. But they also seem to continue to dismiss any involvement of that new framework. And to me, I feel like any good Fed chair anyone on the Fed should be very careful to critique their past actions and be willing to admit them when they're wrong, but preferably not 40 years later, or what was it, Bernanke? It was like, we finally admit we helped cause the Great Depression. And what was that? We're getting closer to 80 years later, right? So I would like them to do that retrospective much sooner.
So I have a couple follow-up questions that I actually want to talk about 2009 for a minute. But before I get into kind of the inflationary environment from, say, the financial crisis to 2020 when inflation ran very low, can you remind listeners, before I get there, like what is, because for a lot of folks that listen, they don't really know what terms like dual mandate means, which would be, so can you remind us, like, what is the dual mandate? Yeah. And then I'll kind of add some color of why, like what changed based on what you told me. So what's the dual mandate?
Yeah, so the dual mandate, the Federal Reserve is a creation of Congress, and technically our Constitution puts the monetary authority rests with our Congress. But Congress has delegated that authority to the Fed, and they have told the Fed, these are the things we want you to focus on in the conduct of monetary policy. This is a law from 1977 that says you will focus on maximum employment and price stability. And actually, there's a third component, which is stable long-term interest rates. But the thinking behind that mandate is that there is this trade-off between employment and inflation.
The Phillips curve.
The Phillips curve, yeah. And if you get that right, you will get stable long-run interest rates. So we kind of ignore that last part. I don't think we should actually quite ignore it. I also think that dual mandate was set up in 1977 after the Phillips curve relationship had already broken down. We had experienced
and Friedman pointed that out. Yeah.
Yeah. So do not underestimate the power. I have worked in Congress at the early part of my career. Do not underestimate the ability for
there's some irony there.
For ideas that should have not lived past their day to be enshrined into law. It does happen, and happens more frequently than I'd like to admit.
When you said the date, Lydia, I was like, for real, in 1977, I thought the Phillips curve had, not that it was disproven, but that there were environments where the Phillips curve does not, like, it completely breaks down. So yes,
and
Congress
we have just lived
never ceases to amaze.
Yes, yeah. So I love to go into more of like the legislative history behind that, but that thinking that thinking still pervades, right?
Sure,
the idea that there is this trade-off between you can increase inflation and that should increase employment, and you want to decrease inflation, but that's going to decrease employment or rather increase unemployment. And there's this expectation that it's essentially like a one-for-one trade-off. But we have lived through inverse relationship. One goes up, the other should go down. But we have had these stagflationary periods, especially the one in the 70s, but there's an argument that we may be entering that an environment like that now, where you end up with high inflation, employment seems relatively okay, but your growth is just low. And even the Fed in this year has continued, every time it releases its new economic projections, is consistently sort of reducing what the GDP outlook, the overall output of our economy might look like by the end of the year, while inflation continues to remain relatively elevated, at least elevated compared to their 2% stated target. So that's the dual mandate, is saying, hey, we think there's still this roughly one-for-one relationship, inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So therefore, we told the Fed, make sure you look at these two things. Interestingly, though, most central banks across the globe usually have one mandate, or if they have another mandate, I think like the the central bank in is it Iceland? They also have like a payment system, like smooth functioning of the payment system. But pretty much every other central bank has a single mandate focused on price stability. And there's a reason for that. If you focus on price stability, long-run prices become somewhat stable, businesses can make decisions and long-term planning accurately, and therefore can have longer-term stable employment. So there really actually is a huge argument to be made that we have incorrectly set up our system, and I feel bad. We basically told the Fed to do something that isn't really a trade-off. If they would just focus on one, price stability, we would get the employment part of that mandate as well. You don't need to put it into law in a way that causes them to get distracted from price stability, because price stability is the thing that will get you all of the other things. And the history shows and backs this up.
That makes perfect sense. And like ultimately adding in the labor component or the employment component does now based on what you said really does muddy the waters, and I think gets the Fed away from first principles. Like, what are we here to do? And what we're here to do is create a level of price stability. And so it is, I guess I didn't realize that other central banks approach these questions quite differently. So real quick, and I know you know, before we hit play, you're like, I don't know if we can really like go past an hour. Well, you haven't met Drew Benson. I could keep you here for 2 hours, and I won't do that to you. So the next thing,
listeners, I'm sorry.
I'm liking it. Hopefully the listeners are liking it. But I'm a bit of a nerd. So the next thing I have for you is, all right, so let's so to layer that in. So the Fed was basically basing monetary policy on the dual mandate. And then you said in 2020, they started to layer in additional mandates, like I'll call it a DEI mandate or employment for minority mandate. Those are the types of additional mandates that got layered on in that time frame that then further altered monetary policy moving forward. Is that a correct, recap of what you said earlier?
I think it is.
Or is there more that you want to add?
It's roughly correct, but I want to be careful. A lot of people view the inclusive part of the mandate, by them adding the inclusive part to the employment side of the mandate. Some people think that, oh, well, that is in line with maximum employment. But I do think that it is. Some others have characterized it a little bit more as mission creep, that they are interpreting maximum employment in a way that's not sustainable for the economy. And therefore, they are layering on. So there is a little nuance there. I wouldn't want to oversimplify, but I do think that it may have distracted the Fed from their primary goals, or the primary thing that monetary policy can actually affect, which is price stability.
Let's go back to 2009 for just a moment. So this is the thing that I think is confusing for a lot of folks. Now, I have a theory on this, and actually, before we hit play, we were talking about Dr. David Hummel, or Jeffrey Hummel. I had another professor there that is first name David. And I'm mixing the two. David Henderson,
a hybrid professor.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, David Henderson, wonderful.
Yeah. If you put those two guys together, it would be like the perfect economist.
Might create a black hole or something. Like too much goodness in one spot.
That's right. The Earth wouldn't know how to handle it. The space wouldn't know how to handle it. So I had both of those gentlemen. I was very fortunate to sit under great thinkers. And one of the things that Hummel pointed out during the 2009 crisis is that the way in which they deployed monetary policy did not lead to a spike, essentially, in inflation. Because I think what baffles people is, if you go back to 2009, they did expand the balance sheet from less than $1 trillion to your point, about $4 trillion in the moment. But we went through this wildly low inflationary period. I mean, Hummel would say, or would have said at the time, and I was in grad school during 2009, one of the things that he was saying was, but they're paying interest on reserves. In other words, they're incentivizing banks to not let that money spill into the system. Do you agree with that statement, or are there other components to why inflation ran so low post 2009? And then I'm going to talk to you about 2020 and the differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a great question. I actually just recently had an intern seminar, and there was a young, bright student asking basically this question, like, why didn't we see rampant inflation post financial crisis, especially because you had a fourfold increase in the balance sheet? I think there were a number of things. One, I think, yes, paying interest on reserves. That was the new monetary policy tool that the Fed was already given access to do, but the Congress gave them authority to start paying interest on reserves. The implementation date got moved up to the fall of 2008, and the Fed used that policy, I think, very intentionally. And there was an argument that the Fed was essentially, monetary speak, is sterilizing their monetary stimulus. So they were doing all of these emergency lending components, doing emergency lending, maiden lane, bailing out AIG, and all of I can't even remember all the programs now. That's like ancient history, right?
So true.
But at the same time, while they were issuing out all of this money and expanding their balance sheet, they were starting to pay banks money to not lend any additional money that was going out. I do think that had an effect. I think some of the banking community dismissed that argument, saying, well, if we had a good opportunity, we would totally lend. So no, this isn't preventing us from lending. But I think that you have to also look at what were some of the fundamental changes in the economy at that time. So one, you did have the savings rate overall in our economy increased because people just pulled back and stopped spending. So that is one way. So even though banks' balance sheets rose, if consumer spending was slowing, that changes the velocity of money circulating in the economy, and so that prevents inflation from going up. The other thing you had is you had business activities be subdued. And in fact, I kind of think that business activity was essentially subdued for the better part of a decade, basically from 2008 until about 2015, even into 2016 maybe. And I think a lot of that had to do with regulatory policy. You had a great dampening of business sentiment due to extreme uncertainty around regulatory policy. You had impacts of large changes in the healthcare system that put new rules and regulations on
Dodd-Frank.
Small businesses. You had Dodd-Frank that changed lending requirements. But you also had an expansion in environmental regulation, and as well as the CFPB, which basically led to an environment where we were no longer sort of governed by like what everyone knows what the rules of the field are. There was a lot of uncertainty about what the rules of the game were changing to, and they in fact could change from month to month or enforcement action to enforcement action. And I think all of that had an incredible dampening effect on business activity, which again means businesses aren't asking for those loans from banks. So banks are getting a safe interest from the Fed. They don't need to lend it out and take on any risk. And businesses aren't necessarily asking for, they're not engaging in as many ventures and needing to get that lending. And so I think I haven't yet been able to study it in a way to sort of put numbers to each of those components, but I think that each of those three things absolutely played a role in keeping inflation sort of in check over that period.
Great points.
And I don't think we should be that proud that we weren't at 2% inflation, although if I go back to my actual economic history, I'd love to have like a slightly deflationary, like that's what real good stable money will give us. But but I don't think we should be as worried. Yeah, I think we should look at that low inflation period as at least it was a reprieve to consumers because they weren't having to make adjustments to their budgets every year or every month as it got to be with the COVID inflation. But it still wasn't a signal that the economy was performing well. It was sort of still, it took us a long time to recover from the financial crisis, I think, for some of those reasons.
Very fascinating.
Hopefully that explains your answer.
It does. This is extremely helpful. And by the way, just in fairness to Dr. Hummel, I know he had a whole long list of reasons why there wasn't inflation. So I only picked on one thing that he said, but I don't want to speak for the man. I'll let him speak for himself. One of the things I wanted to add, though, is like I've seen an explosion in this category known as private credit. We're seeing it in the industry. It's been growing and interesting. I did a little bit of research recently on private credit, which basically is financial institutions that are directly lending to businesses. So firms like Blue Owl or Blackstone, not BlackRock, but Blackstone, they're engaging in direct lending as an investment firm, and they're outside the regulatory banking environment. And I think that's a really fascinating thing. And if you look at the trend, private credit started around 2004-ish, 2005, and post-financial crisis exploded, particularly and I would say even the last 5 years, you've seen a huge growth in this part of lending. And that's because businesses were unable to acquire capital and sufficient credit through the traditional banking system. I interviewed Charles Calamiris, by the way. This is a question I'd love to get him back on and ask him this question, another brilliant mind, of like, did we go through a period, Lydia, where, because one of the things he points out in his book is that there can be environments where there's too little credit and too much credit, and the dangers of either one. I think we can romanticize about we don't have too much lending, and that's good for an economy. Well, a lot of authoritarian dictatorships have very little credit. And I think it's really important for a sufficient amount of credit to be in existence to help the growth of entrepreneurs. I'm an entrepreneur and I run a couple businesses, a couple investment firms, and we're even thinking about starting another one. And like I need at times access to capital. And if I don't have sufficient access to capital, it's hard for me to get things off of the ground. And I think anecdotally, I'm probably not far off of the mark of the way a lot of other, particularly much bigger businesses feel. And so I can see how that could have a dampening impact on the global economy. So that's really helpful, and I appreciate you saying that. So let's fast forward, and then I promise I'm going to get to the other questions. Let's fast forward to 2020. And we did it again. So we threw a lot of money onto the system. It blew up. We had inflation. It was different than in 2009 or 8 and 9. Why did it lead to inflation this time and not last time?
Mm-hmm. So excellent question. And economists are still digging through this to see what happened. One, the response was, three times as big, because instead of expanding the balance sheet to 4 trillion, we went all the way up almost to 9 trillion. And so we are, well, I guess it's a doubling of that, but I'm looking at from the traditional, like where it had been previously. But
correct.
So it is true. Central bankers, the lesson they took away from 2009, 2008, 2007, 8, and 9 was our monetary stimulus wasn't strong enough. If we're going to do this, we have to respond big. And I think that was one of the differences is the money went out the door as quickly as they could possibly get it out. And there's an argument to be made that was the appropriate response, especially with the huge drop basically between March and May of 2020. You also had massive monetary stimulus that was quite a bit larger than we had seen in the 2008 crisis. And what the fiscal authorities learned from that episode was, well, the problem with the fiscal stimulus that we engaged in then was that it wasn't quite the helicopter drop that we needed it to be. We need to get this directly into people's bank accounts. And so you had things like the Paycheck Protection Program. And so basically, and then you had the direct Main Street lending, which, sad to say, some people are still struggling with paying back those loans that they got. And so it wasn't necessarily a long-term help for them. But so we just have orders of magnitude more stimulus, both from monetary and fiscal authorities. And part of the difference is some of that may have been warranted, especially if you follow someone like David Beckworth and GDP targeting, which is another way the Fed could try to figure out how much monetary stimulus or contraction they should engage in. And there's a lot of merits to that. Happy to talk about that maybe on another episode. But that frame of thinking is that, yes, you wanted to kind of goose the amount of money in the economy to make up for this collapse in aggregate demand, the collapse in consumer spending, another way of putting that, but also somewhat try to make up for the collapse in production and supply. The Fed cannot permanently make up for a collapse in production and supply. It is just by adding more money in the economy, which at the end of the day, that's the tool that the Fed has. That does not solve the problem of production and supply, right? That is a business decision about what the environment can handle. And so anything the Fed does can only ever be temporary in those regards. And so the first influxes of stimulus, both from the Fed and from Congress, may have helped offset at least the consumer side. We put money in consumers' pockets so they could still spend, although most people actually just sat on that money. But then what we saw is as time progressed and things stabilized, we've ended up, getting a better grip on, okay, what is COVID actually? What are the health concerns? And then some people will say, oh, well, then we had vaccines come online, and all of these things gradually led to an opening up and a restoring of supply chains and things like that. And where people think the Fed got it wrong is that you had this opening of the economy with all this extra money hanging out. And the Fed miscalculated how quickly the economy would sort of bounce back from that. And they thought it would take longer for those supply chains to work themselves out. And instead, consumers just ended up spending more money on even the existing supply of stock. So we basically had the dual problem of you've given consumers way more money to spend, but we still have supply shocks that are reducing the total quantity of goods, which that is one definition of inflation. More money chasing the same amount of goods basically means price go up. And that is where that's basically what ended up happening. And it's partly because the Fed thought that and when they were saying transitory, they thought that it would take longer for things to come back online and consumers wouldn't be quite as active in their spending, and that just didn't turn out to be the case. And then I think they waited for too long. There are also some people have commented that there were some political reasons for waiting to raise rates. Like they did begin raising rates before we hit that really high 9.1% inflation. They started, I think, I think there were a couple rate cuts at the end of 22 and then a few more at the beginning of 23.
They were way behind the ball.
Yeah. And so we'd already experienced quite a bit. And some people say that it may have been, and it's a speculation, but the facts might support this, is that Powell, in wanting to ensure that he was reappointed as chair by then President Biden over someone like, I think Lael Brainerd was the one who was in contention, who's known as being much more dovish, basically was like, hey, I'll keep rates lower for longer. Don't worry, you can reappoint me. I'm still going to make sure the economy, is going to be just fine and growing and look good. And there is some merit to that argument that may have been what happened, because you do see after the reappointment went through in early 22, before we had the highest inflation that we hit, that's when we have a few more limping alongs, and then later we get the much higher increases in rate hikes, like the size of each of the rate hikes go up, and we went up very quickly. And so there's an argument to be said that there was a political economy thing going on here where the Fed,
100%, even
though they're supposed to be independent, was responding to some of the incentives of, okay, well, Powell's like, how do I make sure I get reconfirmed as chair? And so I think that may have also played a role in the inflation getting as out of hand as it did. And the Fed was, I don't think the Fed was caught off guard per se. I think that the Fed miscalculated and may have had other judgments in mind besides just overall macro stability. So that's my take.
I love all of it, and I really appreciate you taking the time to walk through this, because those are questions I've had. And actually, for me today, Lydia, you've kind of sharpened my axe, because I had an explanation, I think partially explained the difference between, say, the 08 crisis and today, but you added in a lot more nuance for me, and I feel like I know more and have a better grasp of what that means. So thank you. I love it when I learn, and you did a brilliant job. Now, a couple things are going through my head regarding like someone like Powell. And I think it's important to remember, and this is a disadvantage, I think, sometimes when you're trained in the academic space, whether it's you're an economist or sociologist or elsewhere, is we tend to put people in a vacuum and we put policy in a vacuum, and you forget about human nature and real human dynamics, correct? And so one of the things, like I've interviewed Samuel Gregg, who's the president, obviously, of your think tank, and he's great at that, of really understanding like, hey, it's more than just like, how does the policy play out in the vacuum theoryville, or how does the policy play out when you actually layer in human beings that have wants, needs, desires? They are driven by a set of incentives. And even though as economists, we we study incentives, sometimes we don't really understand the practical implications in terms of human nature. So I appreciate you pointing out the political economy component because it's real. And people are driven by a set of incentives that may not just be the dual mandate or the additional new mandates that the Fed is now stating that they're going to do. All right. So we've got the backdrop. I think I'm going to have to break this episode into 2 parts, by the way. So this is part 1. Let's go into part 2. Let's talk about today. So we've got about a half an hour here, and I'd like to dig into the rest of these questions. So CPI came in at about 2.7% yesterday. I guess my question for you is, why is it elevated? Is this still a ramification of what we just spent the last half an hour on? Are tariffs playing a part in this? What is driving the still elevated inflation in the United States economy?
I think so. Part of it is I think still wringing out some of the excesses, because you even see money supply has actually ticked back up, and total money supply growth over the COVID period was about 40%, which is huge by historical standards. And we're now back up at those same levels of the money supply as measured by M2. And so there's still a lot of money sloshing around in the economy. And I think this is why the Fed, I think, legitimately focusing on just the economic data, you do not necessarily want to cut rates too soon, because I think there's still a lot of pent-up possibility for inflation to have a resurgence. It is now, of course, complicated by some other factors, policy changes of a new administration. And so, of course, a lot of the headline talking points are, Trump criticizing Powell for not cutting rates and saying that they're behind the curve yet again, and we need to cut rates, and let's cut rates by 300 basis points. And so you have this political pressure to cut. And a month ago, I would have said that it could make sense for the Fed to cut. The labor market is performing fairly strong. Inflation is trending closer to the 2% target, although I still think being at 2.3 or 2.5% on a prolonged basis is still above target. It's still an erosion of the purchasing power over a year, 2 years, that is above my comfort level, at least. But if the Fed is getting closer to that target, which it was, I think it started to think, okay, maybe we could cut rates. But now if we cut rates, it's going to look like we're bowing to political pressure to cut rates. So I do think there's been this added political complication about, wait, we want to be independent, but not. But now we just saw this inflation print for CPI that had us go up to 2.7%. I'd like to see what that was the consumer price index. I am looking forward to seeing what the personal consumption expenditures index, which comes out at the end of this month, is going to look like for June.
And that's what the Fed relies more on, correct? The PCE.
The Fed prefers that measure. Not it is slightly less volatile, but one of the key differences is it tends to do a somewhat accurate, it does a better job of accounting for costs for housing, which in the CPI, shelter accounts for 1/3 of, I think it's almost all the way at 1/3 of the whole index. And so any changes in shelter costs have a massive impact on the overall bucket of goods and services that the consumer is purchasing. Now, it is true, housing is about 1/3 of an average household's budget. So I actually think both are helpful. But if we're trying to look at underlying trends, I can see why the Fed wants to rely on PCE, because the other challenge with CPI, not to get too much into the weeds here, but it is a sticking point, is it's easy to know what rent prices are for people, but how do you factor in somebody's mortgage? And so rather than asking them what their mortgage cost is, because these are 30-year loans that don't necessarily impact, what somebody might pay today, this is something that was baked in maybe 15 years ago when they signed their mortgage.
Sure.
But instead, they ask in their survey questions this thing called owner equivalent rent. How much do you think you could rent your house out if you were to rent it out today on a monthly basis? Like, what would be the amount? And there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into that. And so a lot 100%. Of people tend to think that CPI does tend to, especially in a world where we have very high mortgage house prices, or rather very high house prices, and therefore very high mortgages, people think that might be sort of overstating what is the overall increase, because we are having sort of house price inflation has outpaced other types of inflation. And that's a separate conversation about both Fed policy as well as federal housing policy. But all of those things factor into CPI. And so we did see a large portion of yesterday's increase, or the numbers that were released yesterday for June, was in the housing shelter space. So you're seeing like a 3.8% increase in shelter costs on a year-over-year basis. And so some of that can be a little misleading, but it's also, some of it is accurate. You have people who are renegotiating their rents, and therefore some of these prices are really that much higher. So that, to me, is residual COVID policy response inflation. We did also see, though, in areas like certain types of groceries, things like apparel, things like even autos, if you do the non-seasonally adjusted numbers, which I prefer because that's what a real human being is actually faced with. In those numbers, you still saw basically an uptick in almost all categories, bar a few. But some of those, of course, are the ones
in
that
this
are being
recent
impacted by
reading,
tariffs.
you're saying?
In this recent reading, the one that just came out yesterday. And so you're seeing this sort of, what I'm viewing is somewhat of a almost across the board increase, but especially in sectors that are being impacted by tariffs. Now, I'm not saying that all of that is from the tariffs, and I also, tariffs themselves usually are just a one-time price increase, which would show up in CPI, but in order for it to be like true inflation, it's about a general level of all prices increasing over a period of time. And so if this is just the new norm for these prices, then that might be sufficient, and that's not necessarily inflationary. That just means we have a higher price level, which is not surprising, because when you tack a tariff on a good, the consumer at the end of the day pays most of that, and so therefore those goods are that much higher in cost. But I do think we're seeing some of that. Plus, we're seeing the fact that the large portion of the tariff changes are not necessarily being implemented until August 1 now. And so just seeing, if they are, but we're just seeing that sort of, what are we at? 10% mostly across the board tariffs, plus a couple higher ones on China and a few other things.
Reciprocal. Yep.
So I do think, I think reciprocal is not quite a fair way of characterizing those. It's more, they may be more retaliatory than
that's the rhetoric.
But that's the rhetoric. You're right. But I do think we're seeing some of that feed into it as well. So long story short, like too long don't read. It is a combination of, I think, residual pent-up inflationary pressures from overly expansive monetary and fiscal policy, but we're also seeing some challenges related to tariff policy.
Now, I get the sense, though, that you don't think it's going to, the tariff policy may not necessarily play a part in what is the phrase I'm looking for? Like, it's going to anchor expectations of inflation. Like, do you expect tariffs to be a one-time bump, or is this going to be a longer-term trajectory? I get the sense it's the former, not the latter.
I think it's in general, it's usually a one-time bump. The thing that makes it, and the Fed has said this, the thing that makes them concerned, or Powell has said in his press conferences, the thing that makes them concerned is that it seems as though tariffs might not just be a, here's the rate, one and done, but we might have a ratcheting effect where we keep revisiting and keep increasing. And then we're basically having constant tariff rate increases that then can feel like inflation, even if it isn't actually being generated through traditional means of inflation. But from a consumer standpoint, it absolutely feels like inflation, because those goods that have that tariff put on them are now more expensive than they were last week, last month, last year. And so if there is this continued ratcheting effect where it's like, we're going to put in 10%, but now we're going to add another 2%, or we're going to add another 10%, or, now we're going to do 35% on this group, it's going to make a lot of noise in those price level changes. And some people may interpret that as inflation, as across the board general increase in prices, as defined that way. Does that hopefully answer your question?
That answers it perfectly. No, you're spot on, and I appreciate it. And I think there's a distinction between a one-time price increase and like a true overall level of inflation that permeates the entire economy. And I wrote an article earlier in the year where I had some concerns that the Fed would basically look and completely blame tariffs, because I think it is a really nice little excuse for them, that they would say that, oh, we're dealing with inflation as a byproduct of tariffs, not necessarily as a byproduct of poor policy decisions that date back to, say, 2020 and 2022 in particular. My fear was that they would blame that, because I don't believe fundamentally, based on the economic theory that I know, and look, I'm not a practicing economist anymore, but I did study it for a while, and based on just basic economics, my understanding that inflation, to quote Friedman, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. I think that's generally the case, by the way. I was at a talk recently, and it was from one of the largest investment firms in the world, and he was one of their strategists. I won't name the guy. I won't name the firm. He said that Friedman said that inflation is always and everywhere transitory. And I almost fell out of my chair. I'm like, this is like not even true. I think I left the talk because I didn't want to be annoying, because I'm the guy that'll like, excuse me, sir, you are wrong. So here we are today. I don't necessarily think tariffs are going to lead to dramatic inflation. And I think that's the distinction I want a listener to know. There's a difference between one-time price increase and an overall raising of all the prices of goods in society. Now, what does the Fed do from here, though, Lydia? Does the Fed cut rates? Does the Fed raise rates? Is it possible? I mean, I don't see them raising rates. Is it possible that they don't cut rates at all in 2025? And is there a rationale that they shouldn't?
Earlier this year, I basically was saying that it could be the case, especially with the political environment, that the Fed may end up not increasing rates at all by the end of the year. And I think
decreasing or increasing.
Sorry, not cutting rates at all.
Right.
For
Okay,
the
good.
remainder of this year. Thank you for making sure I'm on the right side of my change.
I knew what you were thinking.
And so I think that that's still a possibility. And we've been looking at if you look at the CME market predictions about will there be a Fed rate cut or even increase, but lately it's been cuts at each of the next meetings. We've got a July meeting, an October meeting, and a December meeting. I think, is there also a September one? I think there's also a September one. And basically, people had hoped there would be a cut at the end of July when they meet, but now essentially the probability of people thinking that happens is zero. I would agree with that. It was possible that in September was when they would cut next, and that's now at a 50% probability as of when I was looking at it this morning. And then the likelihood increases when we get to those last two meetings of the year. I'm of the opinion that, yes, I think the Fed, for a number of reasons, the Fed is taking their wait and see approach, partially because the economic data does signal you should wait. Inflation is still, especially with this latest CPI print, inflation is still elevated above the 2% target. The labor market still appears strong, but we should also be mindful that some of that strength has to do with some declining labor force participation that makes the top line number of unemployment stay the same and look good. But in general, that's actually not necessarily a good thing. And we're also seeing most of the strength is still coming from sectors of the economy, especially state and local governments and education and healthcare. So this doesn't necessarily mean a fully robust private market in the labor markets. And we know that businesses are taking a wait and see approach, partially because of the tariffs. And you hear that anecdotally. That's in the Fed's beige book that they prepare before each of their meetings. I've heard it among folks that I'm talking to. And then you also have businesses that are directly impacted by the tariffs, especially small businesses. So those types of effects, if they're strong enough, will lead the Fed to say, okay, maybe we do want to cut rates. And they will try to say we're not responding to the tariffs because it's not supposed to be the thing they're responding to. Although I do find it a bit odd, because the Fed's like, well, we're not supposed to respond to fiscal policy things, but at the same time, them holding rates steady, their reason for it has been the tariffs. So I'm like, well,
they're saying
either you're doing one or you're not. Like,
right? Yeah. Which one is it?
So yeah. So apparently, if they don't act, it isn't responding to the policy. But if inaction is a response to the policy, is it not a response to the policy? So yeah, sometimes I feel like we're always playing word games with the Fed. Thank you, Alan Greenspan. But it does seem to me that that the arguments for cutting continue to face major headwinds. Will they hike? I think that is very much unlikely. I think that
Same.
they, as Powell has said, they've bought themselves a lot of room just maintaining rates where they're at now based on where we think the natural rate or what the market would sustain on its own. By some metrics, it seems monetary policy might be a little bit tight, but then by other metrics measuring the money supply, it seems like monetary policy might be moderately loose, which basically says maybe monetary policy is right where it should be right now. And so in general, I think they could cut, but I think we're going to have to see a lot more strength and expansion in the labor market, not just a holding steady. And you got to see that inflation number come down. And I just, yesterday was not positive news on that front for folks.
So I'm getting the sense, though, just reading between the lines, that you don't necessarily see a recession. I think that's also the big question is, historically speaking, when the Fed keeps rates elevated, not always, but in some instances, it can trigger a recession like the early 80s. And are we in that environment? Are you fearful of a recession? And I guess, what are the macro trends or signs like industrial production or PMI? What are the forward-looking indicators telling us right now? And what do you think the economy is doing? And to put it simply, are we headed for a recession?
I think we're probably more likely headed for something closer to stagflation, right? Where we're just sort of limping along. We're not actually in negative growth. And if we define recession as 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, which is how AIER defines it, I don't know is that we're going to see that this year. I do think that we are likely to see a slowing of GDP, overall economic output growth. Part of that is just a reflection of how we calculate GDP, right? We had the last GDP print, the first print for Q1 GDP was all of the pulling forward of imports before the tariffs came in, and that put a dampening effect on the outlook. But I think that businesses are still in a relatively strong position. Employment labor force seems to still be in a pretty stable, strong position. And so I don't think that a full-blown recession is necessarily in the cards, but we also have geopolitical concerns, things, related to conflicts in other various parts of the globe. So those are all risks that we should never ignore. But I do think the overall fundamentals are still pretty strong, and a recession is relatively unlikely, barring some major component. And then you also have a mix of other types of policies. So I view the tariff policies as being somewhat contractionary. I don't think it's helpful for consumers. But some of the tax policy in the Big Beautiful Bill, for example, could be beneficial and helpful, extending some of especially extending the tax cuts from before. That's a huge boon to regular households and their wallets, and to small businesses, which are the engines of long-term growth in the American economy. So those things can be positive. But we do have, some continued headwinds. I think we need to be monitoring. I mean, the bond market is unstable is too strong of a word, but our spending outlook in government is not improving in a way to make the bond market as happy as I would hope it would have looked by this point, based on some of the policies that we thought we would be getting at this point. And then there's also this wild card still on the regulatory policy coming on the sort of fiscal policy side. That has sort of stayed underneath all of the headlines. Like, nobody's reporting on the regulatory changes and the clawing back of some regulatory provisions. And I'm still digging into that myself. But these are things, especially like in the energy sector or in the mining sector, we are already seeing some positive growth in that area, partly because of the leasing and permitting processes have been improved and reduced. The regulatory burdens there have been improved and reduced. We're looking at bringing some more rare earth mining back into the U.S., which is something that over the last few years has not been as readily available, mostly due to the regulatory and especially the environmental regulatory environment. And so these are areas and pockets for growth and positivity, I think, to say, oh, okay, these things can be beneficial, and they might help, depending on their magnitude, they could make up for some of the dampening effect that might be coming from the tariffs. But we are a globalized economy, whether that's a good or bad thing. I think in general, I think human history says that that's a good thing. But we are globalized, and if we're going to dampen that globalization, if we are seeing these other pockets of our internal economy improving and just being more competitive, this is where you get real sustainable growth. And so I'm excited about those aspects, and I'd like to see them both get more attention and for the government policies to be going more at trying to reduce some of those regulatory burdens and challenges.
I think something a great points, and I think something I would add to the listeners in terms of like where this economy could be going is that, and part of this is just a hope and prayer that the tariffs are genuinely sort of the art of the deal, that it's a negotiation tactic. I could spend a lot of time personally explaining why that may or may not be a good idea. I think ultimately, practically, my hope is that the tariff levels will actually ultimately come down by a significant amount. And I look, some of the things I've been reading between the lines is there's been some really great reporting out of the Wall Street Journal. And I remember when Scott Benson flew down to the White House and basically looked at Trump and was like, this is Drew Benson paraphrasing, so this is not exactly how the author wrote it. So I'm a little casual here. But the Drew Benson paraphrase was like, hey, Donald, my concern is that these tariffs are going to lead to some economic problems. My understanding of the article is that President Trump said, I'm concerned not just about a recession, but a depression. And I think understanding the words that are coming out of the existing president's mouth is helpful because it gives us a little context into what he might be thinking. And by the way, Peter Navarro, who I think is not exactly in full agreement, and for those of us that are unfamiliar with the dynamics in the White House, I think Peter Navarro is probably the main architect of, that's his name, right? Peter Navarro. Mm-hmm. He's probably the main architect of this tariff policy within the White House. I think he's at odds with Howard Lutnick and with Benson, because another Wall Street Journal article came out, and basically when I guess Navarro had to leave the White House for a personal reason. And the moment he left, the article stated that Benson and Lutnick sat down with the president and said, we need to pause the tariffs. And I don't know if it was that day or if it was the day after, but like all these events happened within about a week's time frame. And then you saw a pause in the tariff policy. Right, wrong, or indifferent, the way I view the current president is he's ruthlessly pragmatic. I don't think he's an ideologue. And I think that really affects the economy. And I think that affects the stock market and affects even the way advisors might respond to a portfolio. And the markets have been hanging on every word that the president says, right? I mean, I've never seen markets gyrate based on social media posts from an existing president, but it has real world consequences that actually affect widows that are trying to live in retirement and generate income, and we're dealing with this extraordinary volatility. I say all that because there is a little bit of hope that there's some moderation that's occurring within the White House, that he actually might back off on some of the tariffs. And I think if the pain stings enough, if they go too far with the tariffs, there is a non-ideological pragmatism to this president where I could see a scenario where he backs off of tariffs. And then you layer in things like regulatory cuts, tax cuts from the new bill. And that I think could be stimulating. But the big question mark, and I said this during the election, and I actually gave a presentation to my clientele about the economy. One of the things I said to my people was, look, if we see a Donald Trump presidency, do recognize that the big wild card will be tariff policy. And we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. And I see a lot of economic opportunity with the Trump administration, but I also see some headwinds that would come from something like tariff policy. What we miscalculated on Wall Street, though, Lydia, is we did not calculate the magnitude and the intensity of the tariff rates and how aggressive they were to start basically trade wars with some of our trading partners. So I view it as a bit of a mixed bag, but I appreciate some of the optimism that you're bringing up. Any comments on a couple of things that I said? Well, let me ask this. Like, what are your thoughts on that? And then secondarily, like, what do you take about this stock market that is just really reacts to basically anything the guy says? At least it did up until about a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I think I agree with the stock market responding very strongly, especially to the initial announcement of the tariffs. It was beyond the magnitude anyone thought it was going to be. I think that day, on Liberation Day, the markets immediately, like, we saw the numbers, the chart, and at first the stock market went up and it was like, oh, this isn't so bad. And then within minutes, as we started digesting what this actually meant and then trying to figure out where the numbers were coming from, I
was on vacation, by the way. I was on vacation.
Oh,
my poor wife.
Your phone
She's
must
like,
have blown up. Like,
my poor wife. She's like, you seem
I think
stressed out. I was like, I'm very.
You owe her a second vacation now.
She 100% deserves a nice vacation. Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no. But so, and you did see, especially through April and even parts of May, those constant, ups and downs and fluctuations, and they were actually great money-making opportunities. And some people were even speculating, like, is there some insider trading going on here with the on-again, off-again nature of the tariffs?
I'm asked that every day almost.
Yeah. Well, that's one I would leave for the history books to decide, but that's not my bailiwick.
Same.
But it does seem that the financial markets, at least, have come to sort of a new steady state. They've gotten used to this change. They've gotten used to these pronouncements via social media. What I had been hearing is that Wall Street is sort of accepting we'll have at least a 10% baseline tariff. That's going to be kind of the new normal. And anything aside from that is something we will take in stride. And I do think that it could be that it's a level of pragmatism, that cooler heads or more pragmatic heads are prevailing, and those are the ones that had gotten closer to Trump at the right time. I do think, though, that because even if it is driven by this pragmatism, which I think is an optimistic way of looking at it and can be a helpful tool for looking at it, the challenge with even that, though, is that if there isn't an underlying principles of operation, it makes longer term planning very, very difficult. It means
so entrepreneurial uncertainty.
Yes, absolutely. And so if we are having to, we mostly entrepreneurs are having to respond to on-again, off-again changes in policy or new policy without any guide to where the policy might be headed other than big, that I think does dampen the economic activity that is necessary for a truly robust economy. Does that uncertainty get so bad it leads to recession? I think my worry would be more that we would end up in that 20-teens environment where people are just holding their breath, which is what I view happened post-financial crisis. And I think that is sort of a missed opportunity for unleashing the ingenuity of the American economy. If you're don't dampen that spirit. Investors across the globe say that the thing that you cannot replicate anywhere else, even if you want to leave the U.S., you cannot replicate that ingenuity and that spirit of innovation that we have in the U.S. And anything we do from a policy standpoint that dampens that and makes it harder to act on those innovative impulses, that will always concern me. And so I hope that you're right, that the pragmatism will prevail so that we can get to those outcomes. I would want to say one thing, because I do have compassion for what some of the impetus behind the tariffs have been. It is true that the U.S. has trading partners that have a number of restrictions on their types of trade. I don't think that the reciprocal tariffs are necessarily appropriately targeted to dealing with those things, and I haven't yet seen the negotiations turn out to say that we're getting a substantial reduction in those non-tariff barriers. But I do want to acknowledge that they are very real and deserve to have had a spotlight put on them. And my hope is that at the end of the day, we actually do get some reprieve from that, because at the end of the day, the freer trade is, the better it is for all people involved, including the American consumer, as well as the nations that we would trade with. So I would just put that plug in for, I do have compassion for some of the reasons behind the tariffs, including also some of the effects from the globalization that did leave sectors of our economy behind. But I would like to remind people, a lot of that, especially things related to textiles and coal mining and areas that were neglected and that Trump really speaks to, a lot of the challenges in those regions also had to do with government policy. And I would like us to fix those government policies that cause those problems and not just say, oh, it's this other country's fault for making this happen. We are responsible on a government side, at least, for exacerbating some of those challenges in those communities. And I'd like us to take responsibility for that and not just say it's somebody else's fault. So those are my optimistic and also like econ nerd things that I like to bring up in the tariff discussion.
Well, and I think your points are spot on, and I couldn't agree more. And I think that the problem with the tariffs is, I, like you, Lydia, have a level of compassion with some of the sentiment behind it, right? That some people feel left behind in the economy. I think it's multifaceted, but I think tariffs is really just a blunt instrument, in the same way that the Fed engages in blunt instrument policy endeavors that ultimately don't work. And I think that's the problem so much today, is that we really view, and I think this is a distorted view of the economy, we view these government agencies or the president or the Fed as having this central planning power. And we all know that central planning historically did not go well, whether it was the fascists in Germany or it was the communists in the Soviet Union. Central planning, there's a lack of information. If you think about Hayek, there's a knowledge problem, and there's a lack of sufficient information to actually make the right decisions. Or Mises, where there's no sort of economic calculation, there's no pricing system to actually know how to distribute resources. I guess my final question to you today is, and we're really coming up against time here, is where do you think the stock market might be heading moving forward? Now, I know it's a leading economic indicator, so it's a little bit harder to know, but are you positive, are you neutral, or are you bearish right now?
I think in general, I'm very much of a long-term value investor kind of perspective of what is happening in the underlying fundamentals of the companies that are traded on the stock market. And I think that overall the underlying fundamentals are still good. Some companies may be a little more handicapped due to not being able to make business decisions that they thought they would have been able to make by this time of this year, and therefore they maybe aren't growing as quickly as some folks had thought. But I think in general, going back to my point about the ingenuity of America and innovation, I think that the likelihood for value investing is that you can still make great return on that and maybe occasionally find some of these stocks on the cheap. And so I try to remind people of that too. Like sometimes, when the market is down, don't freak out, especially for longer term investors or people who are investing for retirement, your regular mom and pop type of investors. It's like, hey, don't look at it as your net worth has gone down. Look at it as you have an opportunity to potentially, expand some of your holdings. But I do think that we're looking at continued volatility, but the trend is still very up. I will say I'm still concerned, and I was concerned about this last year, of the constant hitting of new record highs. To me, that is a little bit beyond some of the fundamentals. Some of that with some of the indexes.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that I think is still largely driven by Fed policy, that it is this extra money floating around in the system that if you look at, people don't talk about the Cantillon effects enough. I still think they matter a great deal. New money coming from the Fed always ends up in the financial sector first. Those are the people who benefit first, and then eventually it trickles down to the rest of us through inflation. So when I see these constant record settings with the stock market, I think that's great for investors. It's also sometimes great for day traders. But it does give me a little pause, even though it's a leading indicator saying everything's great. I do think that sometimes it can be a little bit overly exuberant, and I like to then take it a step back and let's look at the fundamentals. And I get a little frustrated at the Fed sort of propping up that sector of the economy, even though they would say they're not doing that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, except that at the end of the day, the rest of the economy has to pay the bill. And that's what the inflation was from the COVID inflation in 2022. So I take this broader macro approach that there are some good positives at the moment, and especially if you're in the market, it can be good, although it's very expensive to get into the market right now, which I don't think is always great.
It is.
And so I do worry that that constant hitting of those higher, those landmark, index levels, that gives me some pause and says that monetary policy is a lot more culpable for maybe some longer term challenges in the economy, because we'll never see that level sort of recalibrate, because everyone will view that as a negative and view it as like the signs of a depression, even if it is just recalibrating. Like before the tariffs came in, we saw some dampening in the stock market. And in my opinion, I told people at the time, this was a recalibration. We'd gotten a little out over our skis, especially in the tech stocks like the Mag 5, Mag 7. I haven't yet seen that level out. And so I view that actually as some sign of over exuberance, and we should be cautious about those highs, I guess. So optimistic but cautious. I'm a perfect economist, right? On the one hand or the other.
That's right. That's right. Last comment I would say is that if you look at price to earnings ratios on the S&P 500, they stand around 16.7 times earnings, historically speaking. Right now, they're above 20, and there's kind of this new anchored expectation when I speak to market strategists for some of these firms. There's this new expectations that price to earnings ratios are more in the 20% categories in terms of normalcy. And one has to wonder, Lydia, does that recalibrate as well? Right? Like we recalibrated from 24 down to 20, but do we go back to historical norms? And to your point, to what extent does overly loose monetary policy, to what extent has that overly accommodated the equities markets? And, I guess we'll never know. But Lydia, this was a great interview.
Economists will look at it in 20 years and then they'll be able to tell us how much.
Yeah, we'll know in the future, won't we? Yeah. Oh, very good. Lydia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was a great discussion.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the work that you do helping to educate your clients.
Thank you, Lydia. If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com. Or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves risks, and you may incur a profit or loss regardless of strategy selected.